starting off today's deep dive
Yeah.
on kind of a heavy note, that crash in D.C. last month, the American Airlines jet and the Army Black Hawk helicopter.
Boy.
I mean, 67 lives lost, passengers, crew, soldiers, just a terrible tragedy.
It really is. And it's times like these that everyone wants to know, how did this happen?
Right. And thankfully, the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, they've started releasing some of their preliminary findings. We're going to try to take a look at those today and see what we can glean from them.
Yeah, and one of the most interesting things so far is that there seem to be some conflicting altitude readings between what's on the jet's flight recorder and what the control tower was showing.
Yeah, so the jet's black box data, it puts the plane at about 325 feet, maybe 25 feet higher or lower when the crash happened. But the control tower data, they had the helicopter at 200 feet.
Right.
So that's over a 100-foot difference. Is that normal to have that much variation?
Well, all these systems have what we call a margin of error. It's like, you know, you set your oven to 350 degrees doesn't necessarily mean it's exactly 350 degrees in there.
Right.
There's a little wiggle room. But you are right, 100 feet does seem like a pretty big discrepancy. And that's why the NTSB, they're spending a lot of time trying to make sense of those readings. One thing they're looking at is whether there might have been a lag in the data coming from the helicopter to the control tower. It's like sometimes when you send a text message, it takes a second or two for it to go through.
Okay,
No.
so it's not just that the instruments might be off a little, but that it could take a little time for that information to actually get to where it needs to go. Now, what about the helicopter's black box? Will that help us understand what happened?
Hopefully. But the problem is that it ended up in the Potomac River. So there's a good chance there's water damage, maybe even some data loss. But the NTSB, they're pretty good at what they do.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Now, we've been talking about these altitude readings, but we know that the helicopter was limited to 200 feet at the time. Why is that? Especially so close to an airport.
Well, there are a lot of regulations that cover helicopter flight paths and altitudes, and they're especially strict when you're talking about busy airspace, like around an airport. It's kind of like driving in a city. You've got all these rules about what lanes to be in and where you can and can't go, and all that's meant to prevent accidents.
Okay, so like a highway system, but in the sky?
Exactly. So part of what the NTSB is looking at is whether the helicopter was following those regulations, and if not, whether that played a role in what happened.
So we've got those altitude questions, and we've got the regulations, but obviously there's the human element here too. What have we learned about what was happening in the jet's cockpit just before the crash?
One thing we know is that the black box, it captured a verbal reaction from the crew just before impact.
So they probably saw what was coming. That's scary.
Yeah, it is. And to make things even more complicated, the data also shows that the plane started to increase its pitch, like a second before the crash.
Pitch increase.
Yeah.
So what does that tell us?
Well, that's what the NTSB is trying to figure out. Was it an evasive maneuver, like the pilots were trying to avoid the helicopter at the last second, or was it more of an instinctive reaction? Like when you swerve to miss something in the road, sometimes you're not even thinking about it. You just do it. It's going to take a lot of careful analysis to figure out what caused that pitch change.
Wow, so these pilots might only have had a split second to react. It really makes you think.
It does, and that's part of what the NTSB will be looking at, how much time pilots have to process these situations, make decisions, and then actually make the plane do what they need it to do.
It's amazing how much can happen in such a short amount of time.
It is, and these investigations, they take time. The full report from the NTSB could be a year away or more, but hopefully we'll get at least some answers in the preliminary report that's due out in the next month or so.
Yeah, that makes sense. They're basically putting together a giant puzzle with all these different pieces.
It's not just the NTSB either. You've got the FAA involved, potentially even the military.
Right, of course. And it's a lot to take in, especially for the families of the victims.
Mm.
You know, they're dealing with this unimaginable loss.
Absolutely. Todd Inman, he's on the NTSB. He actually met with some of the families and, you know, they're heartbroken, they're angry, they want to know why this happened. And it's a reminder that behind all this data and all this investigation, there are real people who are hurting.
It's important to remember that human side of things. And speaking of Mr. Inman, you know, he had some pretty strong words about how previous NTSB safety recommendations haven't been acted on.
Yeah.
He said, you want to do something about it. Adopt the recommendation of the NTSB. You'll save lives. Yeah, that's pretty powerful stuff.
He's right. There's often this gap between identifying a safety issue and actually doing something to fix it. It's a problem that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and it's hard not to wonder, could this crash have been prevented? And then you think about all the first responders, over 300 people out there in the Potomac River trying to recover the victims and the wreckage. It's a lot to process.
It really is. They're doing incredibly important work.
And, the Army has said that the helicopter crew, they were very experienced, familiar with the airspace around D.C. They even called it routine for them.
Right, and that adds another layer to this whole thing. Military aircraft, they do a lot of training in busy areas like that, practicing for things like emergency evacuations and stuff.
So it wasn't just that they knew the airspace in general. They knew those specific procedures for flying around D.C.
Exactly. And then, of course, you've got to factor in the air traffic controllers. Especially with the FAA having those staffing shortages, it's just another piece of this very complicated puzzle.
It really does feel like every time we learn something new, it just raises more questions. And then you've got former President Trump weighing in on social media, claiming that the helicopter was flying higher than it was supposed to.
Yeah, and that's kind of a reminder that these situations, they tend to attract a lot of attention from the media, from politicians.
Yeah, that can definitely complicate things. So we've got all this stuff to think about. The conflicting altitudes, the rules of the airspace, the human factors. Where do we even go from here?
Well, I think it's important to understand the challenges of Reagan National Airport itself. The location, the restricted airspace, all the traffic. It's a really demanding environment, even for the most experienced pilots.
Okay, so it sounds like we need to take a closer look at Reagan National and how that might have played a role in this accident. We'll do that when we come back for part 2 of this deep dive.
I think that's a good plan.
We'll be back in just a moment. Stick with us.
So Reagan National, it's really like threading a needle when you're trying to fly in and out of there.
That's a good way to put it. Right in the heart of the Capitol, all those restrictions. What are some of the biggest challenges pilots face flying into Reagan?
Well, you've got all these no-fly zones around D.C., the White House, the Capitol building, the Pentagon, a whole bunch of other sensitive spots.
Yeah, so it's not just like one big no-fly zone over the city.
Yeah.
It's like a bunch of little ones all over the place.
Exactly. And pilots, they have to thread their way through all those restrictions, stay in constant contact with the controllers.
And Reagan National, it's not exactly a huge airport, is it?
No, it's actually pretty small, especially considering how much traffic it gets.
So that's got to make things even harder for pilots. Not a lot of room for error when you're taking off or landing.
Right. And if there's an emergency, like say an engine fails right after takeoff, you've got the Potomac River right there.
Not a lot of options for a safe landing. So the combination of things, the restricted airspace, the size of the airport, the river, it's all got to make Reagan National a tough place to fly in and out of.
It definitely does. And then on top of all that, you've got the sheer volume of traffic. Reagan National is a major hub, tons of flights every day.
It's like rush hour, but in the air. What's it like for the controllers?
They've got a tough job, that's for sure. Keeping all those planes separated, making sure they stay on the right routes, dealing with weather changes, potential emergencies, all at the same time.
And they're dealing with those staffing shortages too, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's a factor as well. Longer hours, more stress, more potential for mistakes.
It really makes you wonder, could some of these systemic issues, the airspace, the traffic, the controller shortages, could they have played a role in this accident?
It's something the NTSB will be looking at very closely, that's for sure. They'll be going over all the air traffic control recordings, radar data, everything they can get their hands on.
It's just another reminder that when we talk about aviation safety, it's not just about the pilots, it's about the whole system.
Absolutely. Pilots, controllers, maintenance crews, the people who design the planes, the people who make the rules, everyone has a role to play.
And then you've got the NTSB recommendations, things that could potentially prevent accidents like this from happening in the first place. If we know about these potential dangers, shouldn't we be doing everything we can to fix them?
That's exactly what Todd Inman's been saying. He's seen the consequences of inaction, and he doesn't want to see it happen again.
I know people tend to think flying is inherently risky, but the truth is, aviation is incredibly safe.
It really is. And the reason for that is that people are constantly working to make it safer, looking for ways to improve things, coming up with new technologies, new procedures.
So it's not about accepting that there will always be accidents. It's about constantly striving to prevent them.
Exactly. And that's why these investigations are so important. It's not just about finding out what happened in this particular case. It's about learning from it so we can prevent similar tragedies in the future.
It's a good reminder that even in the face of something like this, there's still hope for progress.
There is.
Well, before we move on, let's take a moment to think about the victims of this crash and their families. We've been talking about the technical aspects, the political side of things, but we can't forget about the human cost of this tragedy.
You're right. 67 people lost their lives, and their families are going through unimaginable pain right now. It's important to remember that.
Absolutely. And when we come back for part 3, we'll shift gears a bit and look at some of the political fallout from this accident, including statements from former President Trump and calls for review from Congressman Beyer. It's a reminder that even in something as technical as aviation safety, politics always plays a role.
It's a part of the conversation we can't ignore.
We'll be right back after a quick break. Okay, so picking up where we left off, let's talk about the political side of all this.
Yeah.
We mentioned former President Trump's comments, but Congressman Beyer, he's been pretty vocal too.
Yeah, he's calling for a full review of helicopter safety, especially around D.C.
It makes sense. I mean, this accident, it really highlights those concerns about flying in such a crowded and sensitive airspace.
It does, and I think Beyer's point is, let's learn from this. Let's make sure something like this doesn't happen again.
So it's not just about finding out what happened in this one crash. It's about using this as a chance to look at the bigger picture.
Exactly.
What are some of the specific things Beyer wants to look at?
Well, he's talking about everything from how pilots are trained to how helicopters are maintained, even the routes they're allowed to fly. And he's really focused on how controllers and helicopter pilots communicate, especially when things get busy.
It's interesting. We were talking earlier about how challenging it is for pilots to navigate around D.C., but with helicopters, it's a whole other level, right? I mean, they're flying lower, they can maneuver differently.
Right. And that's one of the questions Beyer and others are raising. Are the rules that we have now, are they enough to keep things safe when you've got helicopters flying around airports and all these restricted areas? It's complicated for sure.
And then there's the question of who's actually in charge of making sure all these safety procedures are being followed.
Yeah, that's a big one. You've got the FAA, you've got the military. Sometimes it's not clear who's responsible for what.
And then when you throw politics into the mix, it can get even more complicated. You've got a former president making claims without any evidence. You've got a congressman calling for investigations. It just seems like it could easily turn into a big mess, and we lose sight of what's really important.
Yeah.
Safety.
It's a valid concern, and that's why it's so important to keep these conversations focused on facts and not on politics.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's about saving lives. But, it's also important to have people like Beyer speaking up, asking tough questions, pushing for change.
Absolutely. We need leaders who are willing to hold people accountable and make sure that we're doing everything we can to keep our skies safe.
So it's a balancing act. That reminds me of something we've been talking about throughout this deep dive, that balance between safety and efficiency.
Right, because we all want to get where we're going quickly, but not at the expense of safety.
Exactly. So how do we make sure that those two things aren't working against each other?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that safety has to be the top priority. Always.
But that doesn't mean we can't make progress, right?
Yeah.
I mean, technology is always evolving.
Of course not. We're seeing a lot of new technology in aviation, things like that next-gen air traffic control system. It uses GPS and all sorts of advanced data to make flying more efficient and safer at the same time.
So it's not an either situation. We can have both. But it takes commitment and it takes investment.
It does. And it takes a change in how we think about safety. It's not just a cost. It's an investment in the future of aviation.
I think that's a great point to end on. We started this deep dive talking about this one tragic accident in D.C., but it's really about so much more than that. It's about technology, it's about politics, it's about the human cost of these kinds of events.
It's about learning from those events so we can prevent them from happening again.
Exactly. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. And to all our listeners out there, stay safe.